Have you ever reached a point where quitting felt like the only relief? Not because you are incapable, not because you failed, but because something inside you feels completely exhausted. You wake up, and the thought of continuing feels heavy. What once motivated you now feels distant. The fire that used to push you forward is barely a spark. And the most confusing part? From the outside, nothing is obviously wrong. You're still functioning. You're still showing up. You're still doing what needs to be done. But internally, something has shifted, and the urge to quit begins to grow. This is the moment most people panic. They think, I'm losing discipline. I'm becoming weak. I'm sabotaging my own success. But what if the urge to quit is not weakness? What if it is a psychological threshold? Carl Jung understood that development is not linear. The psyche moves in cycles. There are periods of expansion, where energy flows outward, ambition rises, and effort feels natural. And then there are periods of contraction, where energy withdraws and the old structure begins to lose vitality. The contraction phase is uncomfortable, because the ego interprets it as regression. But contraction is not regression. It is reorganization. Think about a very real example. Imagine someone building a business for years. They worked tirelessly, long nights, sacrifices, constant learning. The growth was steady. The momentum felt real. Then suddenly, they wake up one day and feel nothing. The numbers might still be decent. The systems still run. But internally, something feels hollow. They try to reignite the excitement. They set new goals. They consume more information. They push harder. But instead of motivation returning, the exhaustion deepens, and a quiet thought appears. I don't want this anymore. That thought is terrifying, because quitting feels like failure, but staying feels unbearable. This inner conflict is not laziness. It is tension between who you were and who you are becoming. Jung described individuation as a process where the psyche gradually aligns with a deeper center, the self. But during that process, the ego must periodically release outdated identities. And when an identity begins to dissolve, it does not feel inspirational. It feels destabilizing. If you have built your sense of worth around being consistent, ambitious, and resilient, then the urge to quit feels like betrayal. You tell yourself, strong people don't quit. Successful people push through. But here is something rarely acknowledged. There is a difference between quitting out of avoidance and releasing something that has completed its role in your development. Avoidance feels anxious and reactive. Completion feels heavy, but clear. Avoidance says, this is too hard. Completion says, this no longer fits. The problem is that in the beginning, both feel similar. You feel tired. You feel irritated. You feel disconnected. So how do you tell the difference? Start by observing the quality of your exhaustion. Burnout from overwork often comes with a desire to rest and then return. If you take a short break, you feel some energy come back. But identity exhaustion feels different. Even when you rest, you don't want to return. Even after a vacation, the thought of continuing feels misaligned. Let's bring this closer to daily life. Maybe you've been studying for a certain career path for years. Everyone expects you to finish. You expect yourself to finish. It has become part of your identity. But over time, your interests quietly shifted. You began reading different topics, imagining different environments, feeling drawn to different conversations. Yet you keep pushing forward because you already invested too much. So you silence the new curiosity. You double down on the old plan. And slowly resentment builds. Not resentment toward the path. Resentment toward yourself. Because deep down, you know you are forcing continuity. The urge to quit is often the first honest signal that the old structure has reached its psychological limit. And limits are not signs of weakness. They are signs of transition. But transitions feel like chaos before they feel like clarity. When the urge to quit appears, your mind may spiral. What if I regret this? What if I start over and fail? What will people think? These thoughts are ego protection mechanisms. The ego fears loss of identity more than it fears exhaustion, so it would rather keep you tired than uncertain. That is why many people stay in paths that drain them. not because they lack courage, but because they fear destabilization. Jung believed that psychological growth requires tolerating uncertainty. The old must dissolve before the new stabilizes. But the dissolving phase feels like falling apart. You lose motivation. You lose certainty. You lose emotional attachment. And you interpret it as collapse. But what if it is preparation? Think about how the body heals. Before new tissue forms, damaged tissue must break down. The breaking down does not look productive. It looks messy. Psychological development works similarly. Before a new orientation can form, the old one must lose energy. That loss of energy feels like want to quit. It feels like standing at a cliff edge between what was and what could be. And the scariest part is that you cannot see what comes next yet. So the mind tries to escape the discomfort by labeling it negatively. I'm inconsistent. I never finish what I start. I'm losing my edge. But what if the urge to quit is not about inconsistency? What if it is about evolution? There are moments in life where continuing would require betraying your current truth, and quitting would require facing uncertainty. Both feel uncomfortable, but only one leads to alignment. In this first stage, you are not making decisions. You are observing. You are noticing the quality of your fatigue. You are distinguishing between temporary stress and deeper misalignment. You are asking, if I imagine continuing this exact path for the next 5 years, what do I feel in my body? Tightness? Heaviness? Or steady engagement? And if I imagine releasing it, even slightly, do I feel panic alone? Or panic mixed with relief? That mixture of fear and relief is often the signal of a turning point, because relief means something inside you is ready for change. The urge to quit is not always the end of discipline. Sometimes it is the beginning of honesty, and honesty is where real transformation begins. The moment you want to quit does not feel heroic. It feels humiliating. You look at something you once cared about and think, I don't have it in me anymore. That thought alone can shake your identity, because you have always been the one who endures, the one who pushes through, the one who finishes what they start. So when the urge to stop appears, you don't just question the path, you question yourself. But here is something crucial to understand. There is a difference between fatigue from effort and fatigue from misalignment. Effort fatigue says, I need rest. Misalignment fatigue says, I need truth. And the second one does not disappear with sleep. You can take a weekend off, a vacation, a break from social media. But when you return, the heaviness returns with you. That is because the issue is not workload. It is structure. Carl Jung described psychological development as a series of inner reorganizations. The psyche does not remain fixed. It evolves. And when an identity has fulfilled its developmental role, it begins to lose vitality. That loss of vitality feels like collapse. You wake up and something that once gave you meaning feels neutral, or worse, draining. Let's bring this into something concrete. Imagine someone who dedicated years to proving themselves. Maybe they grew up needing to achieve in order to feel valued, so they became high-performing, reliable, driven. Their ambition was not fake. It was necessary. It helped them build stability, confidence, recognition. But after years of operating from that drive, something shifts. They no longer feel fueled by proving themselves. The hunger fades. And without that hunger, the work feels empty. Now they feel lost, because if they're not the achiever, who are they? This is the stage where many people interpret growth as failure. They think, I've lost my edge. But what if the edge was only needed for a season? What if the identity that once protected you is no longer required? The urge to quit often appears when the psyche is dismantling a survival-based structure, and survival-based structures feel permanent while you're inside them. For example, you stayed in a relationship because you fear being alone. You chase a career because you fear being insignificant. You overwork because you fear being average. Fear can be an incredibly powerful motivator. But once the fear weakens, once you no longer need that structure for protection, the motivation attached to it dissolves. And when it dissolves, you feel like quitting because the original emotional fuel is gone. This is not laziness. It is maturation. The ego does not like this stage. The ego prefers clarity and control. It wants to know what comes next before releasing what exists now. But psychological reorganization does not work that way. First, the old structure weakens. Then comes confusion. Then comes space. And only after that does a new orientation form. The confusion phase is the most uncomfortable because you're no longer fully invested in the old path, but the new one is not visible yet. So you float. You question everything. You wonder if you're making a mistake. And this is where people panic and rush decisions. Some quit impulsively to escape discomfort. Others cling harder to avoid uncertainty. Both reactions are attempts to avoid sitting in the in-between. But the in-between is where transformation happens. Think of it like renovating a house. Before rebuilding, you must tear down parts of structure. During demolition, the house looks worse than before. It looks chaotic, dust everywhere, walls missing. If you walked in during that phase, you might think the house is being destroyed. But in reality, it is being prepared. Your psyche works the same way. The urge to quit is often the psychological demolition stage. The old identity is losing its emotional charge. And without emotional charge, effort feels mechanical. You go through the motions. You show up, but you feel disconnected. This disconnection scares you because you equate intensity with purpose. But purpose is not always intense. Sometimes purpose emerges after intensity fades. Here is something important to examine. When you think about quitting, what exactly are you imagining? Are you imagining relief? Are you imagining freedom? Are you imagining finally not having to prove something? If quitting feels like collapse alone, that is one thing. But if quitting feels like collapse mixed with relief, that mixture is meaningful. Relief signals that something has been too tight for too long. Jung emphasized that neurosis often arises from living in contradiction to oneself. When you continue a path that your deeper psyche has outgrown, tension accumulates. That tension can manifest as anxiety, irritability, loss of enthusiasm, even physical symptoms. And the mind tries to solve it by increasing effort. But effort cannot solve structural misalignment. Let's use a simple, everyday situation. Imagine you committed to a social circle years ago. At the time, you shared similar values, similar interests, similar humor. But over time, you changed. You became more introspective, more selective, more honest. Now, when you attend gatherings, you feel slightly out of place, not dramatically uncomfortable, just subtly disconnected. You try to be the old version of yourself, the outgoing one, the agreeable one, and afterward, you feel drained. That drain is information. It does not mean the people are bad. It does not mean you are superior. It means the structure no longer fits who you are becoming. Multiply that subtle mismatch across a career, a relationship, or a life goal, and the urge to quit becomes intense. Because staying requires constant self-adjustment, and constant self-adjustment is exhausting. This is why the desire to quit often peaks right before clarity, because the psyche has removed the old fuel, but the ego has not yet accepted the transition. So you stand at the edge, and it feels like emptiness. But emptiness is not the end. It is the clearing. If you can tolerate this stage without rushing to either extreme, without impulsively abandoning everything or rigidly forcing continuity, something begins to shift. You start to see patterns. You start to notice what genuinely interests you without pressure. You start to feel subtle excitement about different possibilities. Not loud excitement, quiet curiosity. Curiosity is often the first sign of new direction. But you will not feel curiosity if you are still clinging to what is dissolving. The urge to quit is not always telling you to stop immediately. Sometimes it is telling you to stop identifying so tightly with the current structure, to loosen your grip, to allow space, to admit that something has changed inside you. And that change is not betrayal. It is development. If you are standing at that threshold right now, understand this. You are not falling apart. You are reorganizing. And reorganization feels like collapse before feels like clarity. The key is not to silence the urge to quit. It is to investigate it. What exactly feels complete? What exactly feels forced? What part of you is tired? And what part of you might be ready for something new? The answers may not come immediately, but the willingness to ask these questions is already a turning point. The most dangerous moment is not when you want to quit. It is when you want to quit and you shame yourself for it, because shame pushes you back into force, and force keeps you stuck in a structure that may already be collapsing. Right now, you might be standing in that exact place. Half of you wants to walk away. Half of you wants to prove you can endure, and the tension between those two halves is exhausting. But here is something very important. The turning point is not the moment you quit. It is the moment you stop lying to yourself. Carl Jung believed that transformation begins with confrontation, not with the world, but with the truth inside you. If you feel the urge to quit, instead of suppressing it or acting on it impulsively, sit with it. Ask it questions. What exactly am I tired of? Is it the effort itself, or the identity attached to it? If no one were watching, would I still choose this path? These are not dramatic questions. They are practical. For example, imagine you've been building a career in a field that once made sense. It paid well. It gave you stability. It gave you identity. But now, every achievement feels strangely empty. You still perform. You still succeed. But you feel detached from your own success. The urge to quit is not about difficulty. It is about meaning. And meaning cannot be forced. You can force performance. You can force productivity. But you cannot force aliveness. If something no longer feels alive, pushing harder will only make the numbness worse. Now here is the deeper layer. Sometimes you don't actually want to quit the external thing. You want to quit the version of yourself that built it. That version may have been driven by fear, insecurity, or the need for approval. It got you far, but it was never meant to carry you forever. There comes a stage in psychological development where fear-based ambition loses power. And without fear as fuel, you feel empty. You might interpret that emptiness as loss of ambition, but it could be the birth of healthier ambition. Ambition that is not about proving, but about expressing. This is why the urge to quit often appears right before reinvention, because the old motivation dies before the new one stabilizes. And death, even psychological death, feels frightening. Let's bring this into everyday experience again. Think about a long-term relationship. At first, it may have been fueled by passion, novelty, and emotional intensity. Over time, that intensity fades. Now you are left with something quieter. If the relationship is aligned, the quiet phase feels safe and grounded. If it is misaligned, the quiet phase feels empty, and you start thinking about leaving. But you hesitate, because leaving means uncertainty. Staying means predictability. Most people choose predictability, even if it costs them aliveness. The turning point happens when you value alignment more than predictability. When you are willing to tolerate uncertainty for the sake of truth. This does not mean quitting recklessly. It means no longer ignoring the internal signal. Here is something you can do practically. Instead of making a final decision, experiment with loosening your grip. Reduce emotional investment slightly. Stop over-identifying with the outcome. Allow yourself to imagine alternatives without judgment. Notice what happens inside you. If you feel deeper clarity emerging, that is information. If you feel temporary anxiety but underlying relief, that is information. But if you feel pure panic and avoidance, that may signal you are running from difficulty rather than completing a cycle. The difference lies in honesty. Avoidance is reactive and chaotic. Completion feels heavy, but grounded. Completion carries grief. Avoidance carries urgency. If you are at a turning point, grief is normal. You may grieve the time invested, the effort spent, the image you built, the expectations others had of you. Grief does not mean you made a mistake. It means something mattered. But something can matter deeply and still be complete. Jung wrote, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Becoming requires letting go. And letting go feels like quitting from the outside. But psychologically, it may be progression. If you imagine continuing your current path for years and feel smaller, tighter, more resentful, pay attention. If you imagine releasing it and feel scared but slightly expanded, pay attention. Expansion mixed with fear is growth. Contraction mixed with obligation is stagnation. The urge to quit is not always an escape. Sometimes it is your psyche saying, "This chapter has given you what it could." And if you ignore that signal long enough, the lesson will become louder. Burnout, conflict, emotional numbness. The turning point does not announce itself dramatically. It often arrives as quiet exhaustion. A simple thought. I can't keep doing this the same way. That thought is not weakness. It is awareness. And awareness is where transformation begins. If you're standing at that edge, you do not need to leap blindly. But you do need to stop pretending nothing has changed. Something has changed. Your energy, your motivation, your internal structure. And the moment you acknowledge that change without shame, you are already moving, not backward, forward, because the real turning point is not quitting. It is choosing alignment over fear. And once you make that internal choice, your outer life will eventually follow. Wanting to quit does not automatically mean you are weak. Sometimes it means you are honest. There are moments in life when continuing would require ignoring what has already changed inside you. And that inner change is often subtle. Your energy shifts. Your motivation fades. The identity that once drove you no longer feels alive. The ego interprets this as failure. But psychologically, it may be completion. Carl Jung understood that growth requires cycles. Expansion is followed by contraction. Construction is followed by reorganization. When a structure has fulfilled its role in your development, it begins to lose vitality. And when vitality fades, the urge to quit appears. The key is not to react impulsively, and it is not to shame yourself into staying. It is to investigate. Ask yourself, am I avoiding difficulty or outgrowing this version of myself? If I continue, do I feel expanded or diminished? If I release this, do I feel only fear or fear mixed with relief? Relief is important. Relief means something inside you is ready. You do not need dramatic decisions today, but you do need honesty. The real turning point is not the external act of quitting. It is the internal moment you admit that something has changed. When you choose alignment over obligation, clarity begins to form. And what feels like the end of one chapter may quietly be the beginning of a more accurate one. Sometimes the urge to quit is not the end. It is the threshold,